Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today, I'm so excited to talk to Joe Lansdale about HACHETT Girls. Joe is an Edgar Award winner, an American Mystery Award winner, a British Fantasy Award winner, and the winner of 11 Bram Stoker Awards. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here as well. I told Joe before we started recording that I'm going to fanboy a little bit on him because he is a masterclass. I'm telling you, this book, HACHETT Girls, is a roadmap to how to write a good, wonderful buddy book that is filled with humor and serious things as well. So give the audience a little setup for those who might not know who Hap and Leonard are, and also what this caper is about.
Well, Hap and Leonard are a pair of friends that I started writing about in the late 80s. I think the first book appeared in 1990, but I think I wrote it in 1989. And Hap is based on me. The biggest difference is that I age and Hap doesn't, and I'm a little smarter than Hap, I like to think, at least in my choices, not necessarily in my brain power. And then Leonard is his best friend. And the thing about the two, especially when I wrote this book, Leonard was a Black Republican, and he's also gay, which you didn't see that as much in books, then, or hardly ever. It was rare. And Hap and Hap is white and liberal and an anti-war resistor, or was an anti-war resistor during the Vietnam War, while Leonard went and was something of a war hero. So they have a totally different view on these things, but they're really close friends to the point of being brothers. And I always felt that the contrast would make them more interesting. And they've changed somewhat over the years, which I think's reasonable. And I aged them without aging them as fast as myself, because that would be no fun. And they are only the age they are when I write about them. And when I don't write about them, they're frozen in time.
There you go.
But when I come back, I don't worry about picking up in the last year. I start right then. So those are my conceits that I have. But I really enjoyed writing about them. And the last Hap and Leonard is forthcoming next year.
Oh, no. Oh, don't tell me that. I mean, I will say I will be at the bookstore getting the previous 13 because they are such a delight to me. I am a real smart mouth person in real life. I'm of reasonable intelligence, but I'm certainly a smart ass. I may as well go and say it as it is because, it is who I am. And I just don't find so many things as serious as most people do. I really like humor. And Hap and Leonard use so much humor to deflect when they're afraid or when they're worried or when they're working on something mentally. They use humor to keep people at bay while they get their mental stuff going on. And I felt that was such a wonderful device to use.
Yeah, the thing is I've had people say, well, they're not very bright, are they? I thought, no, they're extremely bright, but to me, the humor is the way that they deal with these things because it's the way I grew up and the way I thought about things and the way a lot of people around me dealt with things. A lot of country people, a lot of rural people, a lot of somewhat desperate people to some extent had to have humor, because they didn't have a whole lot more, especially back then. This was a way you described things, the way you dealt with bad things, the way you dealt with good things. Yes. Humor was a tool of life. And to me, that became embedded inside me from all the great storytellers I knew too. Twain was a great example of that. Mark Twain, he would tell you some of the most horrible things with humor, because he got that too. Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, he knew the parallel elements of humor and horror or terror, suspense, whatever. And what people make the mistake of is that they're not just two sides of the same coin. They're blended. Yes. And when they're blended, that's when it works. When it's just, now I'm going to be funny, now I'm not going to be funny, that's not what works.
No, and I think that, a friend of mine years ago said to me, "Are you ever serious?" And it almost hurt my feelings because I thought, well, I am funny. And he understood that. I mean, he really does understand that. But in that minute, he wanted a little bit of levity and he wanted some seriousness that because he'd sprung this topic on me, I couldn't do, because all of a sudden you sprung something on me and my natural instinct is to find something funny about it. He wanted to have a heartfelt moment, but you know, a heartfelt moment needs a little bit of lead up. It's like a romance. You can't just jump into it. You want a little bit of lead up to the action, you know.
Where's my dinner?
Precisely. So something I want to give an example of when I say somebody is a masterclass. I want to give an example. So I am, for the first time ever on my podcast, I'm going to read someone else's work. And this is the end of your first act in this book. It says, life seemed copacetic. For me and Leonard, the way things looked frequently turned out to be less than met the eye. And I thought, really, Joe, now I have to sit up later than my bedtime and keep reading. And I did, because that is the perfect ending of an act to move into the next act in a book. Every book has arcs. And this is one that, you know, as a reader, I knew we were about to turn a little corner, but it made me interested in knowing what was around the corner. And so I went right with it and stayed up far past my bedtime, but I'll get a nap sometime later.
Well, you know, for me, the whole idea is I don't write for other people. Now, I want to explain that before it gets too weird, is I write like everybody I know is dead. I write for me, because I feel like if I've got somebody looking over my shoulder, do they think I'm funny? Do they think I'm serious? Is this a good scene or whatever? Then I'm sort of overwhelmed, because I have no idea what other people like. There are writers out there who are very, very good at that, and I'm not one of them. What I'm good at is knowing what I like. And I know that if I like it, a large percentage of people will probably like it. I'm not going to nail everybody. I start out with that knowing. I don't try to. That's not my intent. My intent is to entertain Joe and hope after I entertain me and I write like everybody I know is dead, then maybe some people will come alive and be very, very happy to read what I wrote for me, and that I wrote it with excitement and I wrote it with energy, and I wrote it not looking over my shoulder.
I love that, Joe. And I think that's a perfect description too, because, you know, writing humor has to be personal. It can't, you don't write humor for the masses. You write humor to make you laugh. If Joe Lansdale is writing a paragraph and you laugh at it, chances are I'm going to laugh at it. So it is very obvious that you have entertained yourself by telling yourself a story that you've enjoyed telling.
Yeah. And, you know, I can't tell you how many people say, you know, my wife or my husband or my lover, my friend or whatever, just said, would you shut up laughing while you're reading this book? You know, or they would say, look, I got to read this line to you. And that's pleasing, you know. So that means if I'm writing for myself, but it means I reached out and I touched some people with whatever it is that I have written. That's a good feeling. I mean, that's what you want. You know, you want that to happen, even if you are like me, selfishly writing for Joe Lansdale and not the crowd, at least in, you know, thinking about it. And the times that I've actually done that, tried to, it was miserable. I just thought, no, I'm not going to do this. This doesn't work for me. I can't believe it will work for anybody else. So that's why I have that motto, is I write like everybody I know is dead, because otherwise you start worrying about what people think. And as soon as you start doing that, you're really no longer writing for yourself, and you're no longer coming from the center of a story. And there are people in stories that say things you don't like. I mean, that's okay. And I think people, well, I don't want to be offended. Well, yeah, you know, I don't mind being offended if it's interesting or if it's good or it makes me think. I may disagree with it even, but I think that you've got to be able to know, especially in crime, suspense, horror, things like that, that offense is the name of the game, because you're dealing with some pretty rotten people. And sometimes you might even be dealing entirely from the perspective of somebody you personally would hate, you know, but you have to have that ability to do that. I'm not out here to try to say, I hope nobody gets offended. On the other hand, I'm not purposely saying I've got to offend people. I'm just writing the story, and the characters are the characters, you know, and if all the characters are designed not to offend, what story is there? You know, what interest is there?
I totally agree. So with Reed Farrell Coleman, I made an observation that I thought in a lot of ways he writes such wonderful mystery novels and suspense novels, but I think he's a romance novelist at heart. So one
Okay.
of the things that you have done is you've given us a male buddy romp or story, but I feel like Joe Lansdale writes through a feminist lens because there's some words you use in this book that could offend women, but
Yeah.
you also cut, I don't want to say cover that up. You come back with the opposite side. You give both your male characters and some of your female characters words to say that really shows your support of women
Yeah.
and feminism.
I consider myself a feminist. The thing is though, I try to write like people I know talk. And when people aren't trying to say, I got to be sure that I have all of my code words right, people don't talk like that. And men do notice women, because, or
They
vice
do.
versa, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And the idea to pretend that that doesn't happen, or it's sexist for some guy to look at a woman and say, I find her very attractive or whatever, that may have its reprehensible aspect on the far end. But there's a middle period there where the woman thinks, I hope somebody thinks I'm attractive, and the man might the same way, But on the other hand, it's got to be more than that. There's got to be more humanity than that. There's got to be more depth than that. And I try to do that by taking these guys who are raised in the country, who are raised in East Texas, who have a certain verbalization sometimes that doesn't fit what people think should be. But chauvinist, Hap is definitely not a chauvinist at all. And he's also a very loyal, monogamous guy with his wife, who she wasn't always his wife in all the books, but she was a girlfriend and then a wife. And I think that that's important for me to write about, because it shows how people, I think, really are, or at least the people I know really are, which if you look at it on a surface level, then you're not really looking at it on a real level.
And I think that's something you did so masterfully, is that you gave us that feminism and that realism, but yet wrapped in humor, and I love that. I mean, Hap and Leonard are really, really funny. And I will say that I'm sure my neighbors thought, oh, Lord, Dan's gone off to crazy town, because I laughed out loud throughout the whole book, even in some of the places that were very serious,
Yeah.
And it's like, but that's a gift you have, that you are able to infuse the humor, but yet at the same time scare the bejesus out of us where you need to scare us. And I loved that.
Well, yeah, and the other thing that I like to do too is I like to do a kind of storytelling technique that I learned that's become, I don't do it consciously, but I learned it when I was a kid from listening to oral storytellers like my father and other people I grew up with who could tell stories, and like reading Mark Twain and people like that, is that they would go off on tangents. And the tangents have to be good for you to do that in the middle of a story and to come back somehow where it connects, or where people are, feel like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I get that. Because the stories, to me, the tangents give you information about these people. They give you information about, I guess you would say, the story you're telling, so people can say, oh, I see what this is really about. Because I use a lot of violence and things like that, but there's also a tremendous amount of satire. And I'm both loving and satirizing the crime novel. I love it, but I satirize it too. I look at the hypocrisy of heroes, and yet the same appeal and draw that we all have towards heroics, whether we like it or not. That's how it is. And I just don't think it's one way or the other. And the books, of course, are I guess what you would call, they're certainly extreme in their own ways, but if you're taking it literal, then I don't know what to do for you. You're there to understand the emotions and
That's
the ideas and the feelings that we have, but not always to take it literal, But I would like to do things like where Hap has a private place where he goes bound by the creek, and where he ruminates and where he looks at his life. And I like that, because I've always lived in the country and I've grown up in places like that. And I like to give that feeling. And it also lets you ride the wave of a story. And it's not just this. I mean, I'm not saying that can't be a good story, but I like to ride those waves, you know.
Yeah, at the beginning of the book, we have a story that when I got to the corner and I turned the corner, I thought, well, now that beginning was really interesting and fun, and I liked it. So I grew up country adjacent. I grew up in town, but the town had less than 400 people, so it was the country. And I know about hogs, and a hog, Porky, figures very much into this story. And I love the fact that Porky, he is woven all throughout the entire book. I mean, and seamlessly. So there's no grandizing about Porky. It's just Porky exists, and he is. I can honestly say, Joe, I'm not really sure a hog started the action in any other story I've ever read.
Well, that may be true. And you know, not to get too much here, but I also try to write in a somewhat literate way, in that the hog is representational of a lot of stuff that's going on, you know, and you're getting a lot of information about what I think is at least my view on humanity through the hog. And the fact is, I raised hogs, and I lived in the country. We lived in small towns and in the country and all that. So, you know, having hogs and chickens and raising vegetables, and I used to plow with a mule. You know, my wife and I first married. Yeah, so I am from the country, so I know what that's like. I also know what a lot of these small meth dealers are like, because of the town I grew up in. I love Nacogdoches, but it did have a bit of a meth problem at one time, and I think it probably still, you know, drugs are everywhere, you know.
Yes.
And my son used to be a reporter for the newspaper, and they would take him out. The cops would take him out on raids sometimes so that he could report on it. And I remember him talking about meth dealers showing up with like, you know, meth in colors for Easter, like they were Easter egg bags. I mean, you know, the stuff you can't make it up. And a lot of the stuff that people think, oh, that, I don't know where you get those ideas. I do.
Right, precisely. And I also think that in some ways, and I don't really want to make too much fun of the people that live in this country, but there's a little bit of naivete about people that live in this country, that those things only exist way over there. You know, so you grew up in a small town. I grew up in a small town, but we knew who the drug dealer was. We knew who the moonshiner was, the bootlegger. Yeah. We knew who the good people were, and we knew who the crooked people were. It is a part of everyday life. So it's not just, you know, New York City and the mafia. No. Oh, no, there's mafias everywhere, just to different degrees. And what you did with Porky, and also the family, Belinda and her children, what you did is through them, you told the reader everything we needed to know about this particular area without beating us over the head with a preach.
Yeah, and you know, I think I did a thing like where Hap, when he first is aware of this family, aware of them, he almost has a certain prejudice himself, because he recognizes himself, or his background at least, in those people. And then, of course, he reconciles that and understands it. But that's the truth. Is sometimes, you know, I grew up really poor, and I had a great family. I was fortunate. You know, I'm not like those writers. Oh, my dad beat me, and everybody, you know, and so many people say that's why writers write, and maybe some do. But I had a great, my father couldn't read or write. And I had just my mother was a big reader. I had just a wonderful upbringing, because they were just such good people. That, not to say they weren't flawed, not to say that I'm not flawed. You know, we all had those flaws, but it gave me an understanding of poorer people and people that were not as connected. And my father even said himself, he said, you know, I may be ignorant, but I'm not stupid. And I always thought that was pretty damn true, you know. And he was my most reliable person in many ways, even though we certainly disagreed on a lot of things. But the point is that people are complex, and people don't like complexity a lot of times. They like it's this or it's that. It's the left, it's the right. It's this or that. And it doesn't work like that. Things are much more interwoven, and more so than people like to think, even about themselves. You know, they think they know themselves, but what's scary is you may not, because I'm writing a memoir now, and I'm getting into this, and I'm going, how many lies am I telling? Because you don't always know.
Well, you know? But also, you know, Joe, one thing that I learned when my parents were getting a divorce. A waitress laid some wisdom on me. She said, Danny, your mom has her truth, your dad has his truth, and then there's the truth. And that's some wisdom I've never forgotten, because what I tell Joe as the truth, it might be my truth, but it might be a shade off from the real truth. And I think when you talk about writing a memoir, it is how you experienced it.
Exactly. It may not be the truth as other people see it, but it's the truth as I know it, and that's what it is. But a lot of things, as the years go on, you massage things, you make them better, or you may make them worse. You may decide out, oh, that was all terrible. Everybody go, what the fuck are you talking about? And pardon the F word, but
I've dropped it. I dropped it a couple of weeks ago on some unsuspecting authors, and I think I caught all three of them off guard. And I was like,
yeah, and I grew up in a place where I was, I got along with everybody. I was never, unpopular or anything like that. And but I was the liberal guy, and there were others too at that time. Most of them were only liberal because they could wear long hair, wear beads, and maybe have some success with women. That's the people I ran with, and I meant it.
Right.
And I begin to have I grew up just like everybody else in the country. I had all these prejudices when I was a child and when I was a young teen, and I began to go, what am I thinking? I remember the racial things, especially, and I remember Martin Luther King, and I thought, wow, this guy is powerful. This guy's got something to say that makes sense. And I'd read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which is the most anti-racist novel you can imagine. I read To Kill a Mockingbird when I was young, and of course, many other things, but those were ones that were kind of like post in the ground that made me think differently and makes me not so judgmental in the sense of even people I disagree with. I mean, there are exceptions. There's some people I think are so awful that I feel they're awful. But generally speaking, some of my best friends have totally different viewpoints, like Leonard and Hap Leonard. They have totally different viewpoints. And some of my best friends are like that. If I went just, you have to believe what I believe, I wouldn't have any friends.
You and me both, Joe. You and me both. So without giving a spoiler away, I'm going to come very close to it. So you have what I consider to be two endings for your book. You have an ending that I would have said, okay, the story has ended. I'm completely satisfied. And then you did what I'm wondering if it was an homage to Agatha Christie or not. Or was it just because your second ending, you do something that Agatha Christie did in one of her books that I think the majority of people don't even think about it until the last movie I saw they made of this particular book, which was Murder on the Orient Express. In the last movie, it's shown very clearly what happens. So how or why did you decide to give us a second ending? And I will say, just for the audience, because I'm not giving it away, but I loved what you did with what I consider to be the second ending.
I didn't really think about it, Dan. What I was doing is I was just writing a story, and that story carried me. But my subconscious is how I write. I'm not somebody that overthinks something, but on the other hand, I'm sure my subconscious is working on it because somebody's got to.
Right.
I only work about 3 hours a day, and I get up in the morning, and when I get up, I'm generally ready. I have certain periods sometimes where I'm a little slower than others, but I only work about 3 hours, and about 3 hours, I get diminishing returns. Dean Koontz once told me that he builds momentum throughout the day, and that by the time of 12 hours or so like that, he's really getting into it. And 12 hours. No.
I'd be drooling on myself at 12 hours.
I got a wife I wanted to see. I had children growing up. I got the dogs. I do martial arts. All these things that I'm talking about during my lifespan. I just thought, you've got to be commonsensical. And I tried to write 3 to 5 pages a day and polish them so that I only did one serious draft. Some days I would get 10 or 15 pages, but I would usually do one serious draft and then do a polish. But by the time I did the polish, I was 98% there, because I find that if I do multiple drafts, I just do terrible work.
I have found that when I've written something that I've held on to it too long, then I begin to nitpick it. I begin to say, well, why didn't they use this word instead of that word? And then I find that just wipes out all the creativity in it.
Yeah, you can be right about the grammar. You can be right about a lot of things, but you can be wrong about the story. The people in my stories, I try to talk like they talk. Like I grew up talking. And most of the time, even when it's third person, there's a kind of third person close, if you know what I mean. And it's almost like first person. I don't always do it that way, but I like first person best because it's always been my favorite because I grew up with storytellers. Yes. And when I read Edgar Rice Burroughs when I was a child, he told the story I read, John Carter of Mars, in first person. And I had to go, okay, now this is me.
Right.
And so it was a revelation to me. And so I write probably 95% of my stuff's in first person. Short stories are a little more variable. I'm a little more experimental in that as well. Excuse me.
But I think with first person, what you do is there's an immediacy about it and there's a connectivity. Yeah. I feel like when I'm reading from Hap's viewpoint, I am Hap. I mean, I can't help but be Hap because you understand he's very right there. But then Leonard is almost, I mean, they're both so very important in what you've done. So I cannot express enough about this is a master class. It is called Hatchet Girls. It is beyond magnificent. And I'm not kidding. Any new writer listening, if you want a master class on how just to move the material along at a nice pace and a good speed with lots of humor, this is the book for it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.